Yeah, exactly. What happens? Not like things get stolen. Exactly. Nobody gets their pen. Alright. That's how it says. Yeah. I believe we're supposed to kick it off by I just saw Kathy's badge. If I don't get the suspenders on my badge, what's the case? Oh, really? Yeah. She like special. Yeah. Extra super special badge. Yeah. So just the proletariat. Uber keeps trying to get us on. I like notifications. Like my staff is like 100% like avoiding this or I didn't say it. I said you don't. I said you don't have to go. You're not required to go. I don't want to make it. I said if you come by and there's no one there, come sit fill a couple of seats in for us. So it's just about 2:30, and I have to be super honest, I did not go to any sessions this morning because I was doing some stuff down in the vendor fault. Are they introducing like they do at Hershey, or are we just supposed to kick it off on our own? Is that the plan? That's good. So if I'd have gone to a session at 11:30 that I was intending to go to, I would know that already. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rich Platts. I am Director of Technology at North Allegheny School District. And just to kind of level set a little bit, I was a classroom teacher for 9 years. Sean was a classroom teacher for a couple of years as well. And so we are certainly open to questions and conversation and open dialogue as we go through this process. We do have some slides and things to share and some discussion points to share about some work that we're undertaking here around developing a platform for supporting our students and some of the steps that we've taken to do that. Sean Hoover, data modeler, so can you just introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, so like Rick said, my name is Sean Hoover. I'm a data modeler at North Allegheny, and I know that's kind of a rare position at a school district. But as we said, what we really want is for this session to kind of cross a lot of different pieces of the network that put a school system together. So whether that's a tech admin, whether that's teachers, whether that's instructional support, all of this work around data governance, interoperability, creating data standards, all of this kind of fits together, and every single person with any role in a school district has an important role to play in what we're talking about today.
So we're going to kick off first with a quick look at our agenda. We're going to talk about our data management pain points that I'm sure many of us share and have experience with. So we're looking forward to hearing from you about some of your data management pain points, and we're going to share what we've identified as some of our data management pain points. Talking about data standards and what some of the data standards are that are available out there, and how we're utilizing data standards as a solution and how we're making commitments to those standards. Talk about the community that we're forming of learners and pioneers through this work and helping to support one another, and hopefully sharing the work that we've done with all of you. And then specifically we've got our use case, which is our first project around supporting a process that we have called pupil personnel teams, and we'll get into details on specifically what that is and how we're supporting that through an EdFi operational data store. Finally, we'll be talking about some of the steps that we've taken to make sure that we can support this and make it sustainable and keep all of our stakeholders informed. And then we'd be really excited to hear from you as this goes on to talk about questions that you might have for other things that you're tackling in your districts. So does your digital ecosystem possibly look something like this? So my boss calls this Rich's serial killer map, and it's blown up on a giant piece of paper in our conference room. And we went to the effort of taking a look at all of these systems. And the problem with putting this down on paper is this was from last spring. We've done a ton of work to take a lot of these things that were in this dotted box. We were doing a lot of manual maintenance of systems. We're a school district with almost 8,500 students, and it's not really sustainable to be manually rostering and getting students signed up for these things. We've made a lot of real improvements to this since then, but we do feel like we have a long way to go. So raise your hand if you have some kind of diagram, if not drawn out, written in your head that looks a little bit like this, right? So typically we might think of our student information system of having a role somewhere central in that. That's a core area where you're storing a lot of student data, behavior data, attendance data, grades data. We've got our finance system, probably tied into your HR management system. That's where your teachers are, and you've got a lot of information about that. But there's other data that sits off of those systems, like absence management, teacher absence data. We've got time and attendance. We've got evaluation information. So this goes out, and we're sending data to a lot of places, and we're receiving data from a lot of places. And some of these arrows are very directional out, right? And they're not, sometimes we're not so good about pulling data back in. And that's because of some of the challenges that we see. So we're going to ask you for a little bit of feedback and take just a few minutes to complete a Menti. So if on your computer or on your phone, you could follow the URL here or scan the QR code, you should be able to follow through with these questions on your phone. We're just going to be asking you, just for 2 slides, about what are your data challenges and ask you to rank. So we're going to start out by ranking some of those data challenges. I'll give you a second just to get to this survey here. Anybody need another little bit of time? Just Ron? I'm going to switch so that we can start taking a look at these results. All right. So we are here, and we've already got a couple of people starting to provide some feedback on those sliding scales. And the sliding scale said from we got this to this is a big challenge for us. And so we can see as your responses start coming in, we're looking at these 4 axes on this. We're looking at common data standard, and we'll talk about what some of these things mean. We're talking about accessibility, giving people access to the right data so that they can get into their different systems. Interoperability, making them interact together with one another. And security and privacy. There's a session next door, which will be repeated in the next session, specifically about some of those challenges around security and privacy. So, which one of these is your biggest challenge in your district? Looks like we've got kind of a cluster. This is what happens when everybody says in the middle for everything, right? So, where are you having issues with interoperability? Can you talk about some specific examples of interoperability challenges in your district? What problems are you trying to solve? What are you trying to solve?
Connecting all student test data to our SIS from other systems.
So student assessment data is a big one that we're also tackling. We're also looking at that. What are some other interoperability challenges that you're tackling within your systems?
Our SIS, we can't push information into because it's governed by like IMS Global. So we have challenges getting, like sometimes it's a lot, it's very complex to get the data in there. So that makes sense.
We notice, we recognize a lot of the same things, that a student information system sometimes claims to be able to take data in, but typically they're designed to ship data out and not so much to ship data in. So what student information system are you working with?
We're within campus.
Okay. Any other issues? Any other security and privacy issues or interoperability issues? When we asked our staff about these, we were able to identify a couple of these. We'll share some of our pain points, discussions that we had, and what we're doing to tackle some of those. But before we do that, let's go on to the next one. So can we just fill in, what words do you associate with data challenges within your school district? I'm going to throw a couple of words up here for us to kind of set the stage for our conversation. No words. There we go. Duplicate data. All right. Responsibility. Accuracy. We're not alone.
Confusing is our biggest contender
Yeah.
here so far.
Do any of these things seem familiar? Is abstract one roster, one term together, or is it abstract and one roster? Interpretation, confusing, accuracy, sharing. Why? SQL. Knowing what we don't know. All right, very good. We had a lot of conversations, and we brought a lot of our stakeholders together to talk about data and talk about pain points. And this was actually right before Sean joined us at the district, and we did this in December. And I started having conversations with our stakeholders about data pain points. And what I found out was people didn't really know what we were asking about, right? When we said data, they weren't sure what data meant. So we had to have some real long conversations about data and where data lives and how data is stored. So we found we had to do a lot of education with our stakeholders about what it meant to manage data. But eventually we talked about our 4 big pain points at North Allegheny were information that sits in silos. So you've got, what are some of our data silos that you might talk about?
I mean, they're quite isolated. So we have our SIS, and then we have our assessments, which is something that someone else brought to light here. Our financial data and our hiring data, all of our operations and employee-related data is completely separate. Even though we would at some point like to look at relationships, for example, between how employees are hired or credentialed and student outcomes, things like that. So they sit in completely separate databases. We have some people who are one-person offices or departments, and they're responsible for every type of data that flows to them. But there's not a team that's communicating with them about their data format or how it's entered or where they should send it or get it. And so we end up with not just information in silos, but we have a lot of processes that are in silos. So I figure out in my office, I have one solution. I can make a Google form and people will use it. And then somebody else who's in one of our school buildings will have no idea that that form exists, or won't know that there's a spreadsheet that it feeds into that could be helpful to them. So we get this sort of patchy network of solutions and problems that don't necessarily talk to each other.
So, yeah, access to different systems. When you don't give people the right access, people share passwords. Yeah.
Yeah, it's got a question. Do you run into issues where people understand certain systems and not others, so there's actually widespread access? Everyone can look at it, but they don't know what they're looking for?
Absolutely, yeah. So interpretation of that data and that sort of thing, and leading people to make that was one of the concerns of our principals group, was having multiple people look at the same data and come up with different interpretations of that data. Absolutely. When we took a look at this, we wanted to tackle some really kind of baseline foundational things that we could improve in this first year. Lack of documentation was a big one that we came across, and we found that just recently we've been working with absence codes, and we've actually got schools that are just completely doing attendance differently, and then it had just been sort of papered over by our system administrator who was doing the database administrator, and so we were fixing it after the data was bad, and instead of training people how to enter the data properly or configuring the system to do that properly. So Sean's been doing a lot of work around just trying to find out what people think they're supposed to be doing, so that we can get to the point where we're able to analyze and interpret data. So I want to just talk a little bit about data standards. So there's a lot of data standards out there. We mentioned OneRoster earlier. OneRoster is probably one that a lot of people are familiar with when you're looking at getting different systems populated with student information, students, and all of that sort of stuff. But there's a lot of other standards that are out there. So raise your hand if you've heard of some of these data standards or used some of these data standards. LTI, who uses LTI at some point? Learning Toolkit Interoperability. So if you see anything anywhere on the web where it says like add to Google Classroom, that's probably using an LTI connector into Google Classroom. So the standard is doing a lot of work in the back end for you without you really having to know a whole lot about LTI. The same is true about something like OneRoster, where your SIS is presenting a OneRoster file, and the vendors all agree on a way to do this. Caliper Analytics is really interesting, being used a lot at the secondary for learning analytics. A lot of times in a learning management system where you're able to actually see how many seconds of a certain video a student watched, or which parts of the video a student watched. This is being used a lot at the collegiate level because they're driven by tuition and they need students to identify students who are not doing certain pieces of their online learning and then maybe at risk for failing out. There's also Open Badges, which is another IMS global standard. Common Cartridge, you might be familiar with Common Cartridge, is a standard way to pass information around. And a newer player on the standards, in the standards body is EdFi. And so our projects are around the EdFi data standard, but also leveraging the OneRoster standard and taking a look at some other standards. So when we talk about our project that we are working on, we're going to be taking a look at EdFi as sort of the primary piece of our standard that we're using to do that. So we're going to talk just a little bit about that. I'm going to talk about what EdFi does for us, and then we'll talk about how our project is supported by EdFi.
Yeah, so I guess if you're familiar with using a data standard, this is probably a familiar chart to you. If you're not, then it's not. But the idea is that we have data everywhere that may or may not be organized, and this is just a data model example we pulled up from the EdFi data model where we have their assessment domain, right? And this charts out, okay, what's the relationship between assessment items, the assessment itself, the objective that's being assessed. And I think what we'll kind of bring up over and over today is that this kind of stuff is going on no matter what. If you give a test, then you have content that you're testing, you have items that students are answering, and you have objectives that the content is meant to be related to. But the problem we're trying to solve is to say, okay, we don't necessarily have the same language here in our SIS that we do in our assessment portal. Or we don't necessarily have the same language in our assessment portal that the state does for reporting requirements. And so what EdFi is trying to do is create what's called a common data standard or unifying data model that tells us conceptually, here's how we might organize our data. And for each district that buys into this data standard and says, okay, we'll work with our vendors, our SIS, or our any of our programs, the vendor will help create an integration with EdFi and say, okay, we'll make your data look like this. and then you can funnel that into a common data warehouse or operational data store, so that you have what's sort of an apples-to-apples data set. What we look at with our data in North Allegheny might look the same as Pittsburgh Public Schools, if we're feeding into the same data model. So that's kind of what that's meant to do, and kind of break that proprietariness of a lot of the vendors that we work with that have great products, but our data within that product has to fit a certain shape. Anything else to add on that?
So for us, EdFi is three things. It's a common data standard, which is represented by the unifying data model. It's a technology, which we're called the operational data store, and we'll show you what that looks like in a second. And then third, it's a community of learners that are, or a community of learning organizations that are working around this work. So we're supported by the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation is really supporting a lot of this work. And they are acting really as a conduit and really pressuring and leaning on vendors to start working with this data standard as a format for receiving that data in. So that directionality problem with the student information system is solved by having the common data standard and then working with our vendors to have them commit to the standard and certify their product against this standard. And so we're working with a number of vendors, including Pearson and Brightbytes and a bunch of different folks to start bringing that data all into a central place. But this isn't necessarily work we're able to do alone. So we're working with a group called UPD Consulting, who works with a lot of organizations that are doing EdFi implementations. COSIN is advocating for this work. The ISTE organization is involved in this work. Obviously, the EdFi Alliance and IMS Global is working together with the EdFi Alliance. And then collaborating with our friends and neighbors here in Pennsylvania as well as we do this work. The goal of this work is to be completely open source, so to share our end product and something that can be replicated by other school districts that's based on this common underlying technology. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. So who's in the EdFi community? It's educators, technologists, vendors are very involved in the EdFi community, and local and state leaders are advocating for the adoption of a common data standard, including a lot of our SIS vendors are now compliant with the EdFi version 3. And there's an online hub that's available for any information you're looking for. It's ed-fi.org, which is kind of easy to forget the dash there sometimes. And they have a technology exchange, they have conversations about this, and there's a lot of information that you can learn from the EdFi organization to get involved. So when we look at this, there's a lot to do. And the question we ask ourselves is, where do we start? And I'm always one to say, okay, we're going to do this, 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 and this. And we've been stopped a number of times and told, don't boil the ocean, right? So definitely, yeah, we don't want to try to take on this entire project. So we've broken this down into two main chunks that we're going to talk about here. Instead, we're only boiling two things, right? We're working on data governance to make sure that we have a foundation for standardized use of our data that we can use to help to develop personalized solutions for students. And then we're implementing that through this process we have called PPT, Pupil Personnel Team. And our Pupil Personnel Team is a support method that we have to support our students who have identified needs. You want to talk a little bit about PPT?
Sure. Yeah, so to kind of just reiterate that metaphor, digging into PPT for us was our way of saying we're just going to take this little pot and try to boil it. It's the most narrow and well-defined use case we have at the district level. A lot of districts have some team that's like this, but for us, what a pupil personnel team is a group of professionals that's assembled to support students who may be at risk. So it's not necessarily a special education program. It's sort of before that happens, but a teacher or a parent or sometimes another student or a specialist says, hey, here's a student who I think because of either their attendance, their behavior, their grades, or something else that fits into the orb of what makes students successful, makes me concerned. And so I want to submit this student to a pupil personnel team, and that team is often made up of a nurse, school psychologist, counselors, sometimes other teachers. We'd like to get teachers more involved, principal. And that team gets together and says, hey, here's what we know is going on with this student. here's what we see as far as patterns in their attendance, here's what we see as far as patterns in their grades, and we're going to look for some sort of soft support to help them before we say we need to refer them and get into labeling or do a full evaluation. If the intervention doesn't work, then the next thing is we push this down our evaluation pipeline. But so what we find then with our personnel teams is that this is a group of people, just like in any district, that has a full-time job to do that's not necessarily data maintenance related, right? So the people who are on these teams are not responsible for the format of the data. They're not on the back end messing with our sys, so on and so forth. So their primary goal is to get the job done, and that means that, I guess our next slide kind of illustrates this. Or let's go one further. So we often have somebody who is manually going out to our sys and saying, okay, this one student's grades in social studies are 85, history, whatever, is 80, math is 76, and then writing that into a Word doc, sharing that Word doc with the team, and then somebody else takes that Word doc and says, okay, well, I'm going to go find out what the attendance patterns are for this student. And then somebody else says, okay, well, here's how the student did on the IELTS, here's how the student did on the PSAT. So we have what we call these manual data walls, where somebody is spending a lot of time doing something that's not necessarily what ought to be their job. So we saw PPT meetings and teams as an excellent use case because this is a group that really would benefit from having a centralized data store. From having all of the attendance data, behavioral data, grades data funneling into the same place, so they don't have anybody who has to go out and ferret that data and pull it in, and instead they use the PPT meeting time to actually make decisions that support students. We also kind of wanted to emphasize that using a data standard and having all of our systems refreshing on a frequent basis, and we can talk about that a little bit more in the future, increases the availability and timeliness of data. So we have professionals who are not just looking at something that someone found last week, but if we have an event or we have a student who's absent all week this week, that new and up-to-date data is part of the solution we're trying to create. Okay, so our project vision that came out of this was to use the EdFi data standard and create an operational data store, which we'll talk about in just a little bit, to create dashboards for these people personnel teams. And of course, the idea there is that we just have simple, straightforward data, right? We're not getting into really advanced analytics. We don't have machine learning going on yet for this. This is really just reporting what are the students' demographics, what do we know about their conduct, and what do we know about assessments and academic performance, just based on pulling that out of the SIS.
So our data's stored in a lot of different places, but we really wanted to focus on which were the ones that we could achieve some real impact for. So obviously we've got our student information system, we've got students using Study Island, we've got a lot of data. We're using the Bright Bytes Whole Child module, which is relatively new, has a lot of social emotional learning data that we're able to capture and bring into this model. And we're very encouraged that they are experienced with the EdFi model and are designing around the EdFi model. And then we've got Ames Web Plus. We're actively currently working with Pearson to be the first district that's utilizing their data right back for Ames Web Plus data so that we get timely data. As that data is recorded, it will come into the operational data store. We do use On-Hand Schools, which is a data warehouse, might call it more of a data mart. And it does house some of this data, but not all of it. And we have not sort of been as successful in getting some of this data in. But also there's anecdotal conversations that happen around students and student performance, and how is that captured and become a part of that record. We've got other systems like IEP Writer, where there's some information. And we also are interested in looking at absence management. Now, typically, you can take a look at student performance data and student attendance data and say, hey, there's a correlation between a student's attendance and a student's performance. But we usually don't do as good a job at saying, what about the teacher's attendance, right? Let's take the teacher attendance and see how many periods these student and teacher were concurrently present in the same class. What's the impact on pull-outs for professional development and all of those different things? So we can start to really assess the cost of teachers being out of the classroom, and we're able to pull that data in. A question?
Okay, so as you're discussing this,
sure.
So you guys, your district, you're building your own tool, your own dashboard. You're working with this other group. It's not like a tool that you're buying into. This is a tool that you're just developing yourself.
Sure. Yeah. So it's a tool that we're developing that will live on top of the EdFi operational data store. So the operational data store will actually power most of that data. And so we don't have to go to Pearson and say, hey, we want to format your data specifically to come into our tool. We want Pearson to go to work with the resources that are available through the EdFi Alliance to be able to write toward the data standard, right? So that can be applicable to other schools, states, and local education agencies that are using this. So yes, we're developing a platform on top of some of this data that can be customized, but also it'll be available as an open source project through the EdFi Alliance. So yeah, there's absolutely some work that's being done. But the intention is for this to be usable by other school districts in the future. This is fairly early days in this project. So to give you a high-level look at the architecture for this, we've got a lot of data sources, and we're really looking at moving away from those flat file integration, nightly uploads, to more modern API-driven data interfaces. So you've got your data sources here on the left. We've got the EdFi ODS, which is going to live in AWS. And then we'll be building our PPT intervention dashboards on top of that. And we've talked about, there's been a couple of conversations about using Power BI, this Power BI plugin. So some of these are pre-built tools that we're able to apply to this data. I think we're looking more to something that's a little bit more interactive so that we can actually use this to track when did an intervention happen and then take a look at the data, sort of a snapshot in time. So rather than having a kind of a fuel gauge, you're having more of a snapshot on a chart and how did the data change after we did that intervention. So the future vision for this is much bigger, right? So the promise of going from that scattered digital ecosystem serial killer map to something where you have this EdFi ODS living in the center, there are plugins that will live on top of the EdFi ODS, whether that's a OneRoster plugin that was developed last year that's being implemented, but this is very heavily API driven. So it's moving us into a more modern way of shipping data back and forth, which is going to help us with a lot of our data interoperability changes. And you can see that unlike our student information system and business information system, this is a bi-directional exchange so that we can put data into the ODS back from our applications. So these may be our assessment applications, and as we look at different applications, integration with an EdFi certification is really going to be a part of our procurement requirements moving forward. So one of the practical things that we've had to do is really kill a lot of the data silos and problems that we've had at our district. So one of Sean's roles is to be as a data governance lead. So we're going to talk you through our data governance process and sort of some actionable steps that we've taken to help to wrangle some of these data problems. So we're going to share just a little bit about what that is.
Yeah, so we just had sort of a data governance kickoff for everyone in our district who's involved with, say, stewardship of data at any level just this past week. And the goal of that was to say, hey, everybody in the district, whether you are a counselor, whether you're working in our assessment office or a business office, you're all involved in our district-wide solutions around data. And whether we're choosing to do data governance intentionally or not, we have some data governance strategy. And if we're not doing it intentionally, it ends up, resulting in bad data in and bad data out. So our sort of shared definition of data governance with them is the overall management of the availability, usability, integrity, and security of data used in an enterprise. And that was sort of meant to incorporate those 4 pillars that we talked about and that you filled out your status with at the beginning of the session on the Mentimeter. And this whole effort is meant to create structures within our district so that we can sort of have a bit of power and decision-making stance over how we manage our data. So it's not accidentally falling into this office or that office, so we don't have folks who are finding a patchwork solution here and not sharing it with the district. Our sort of unifying mission orienting around data governance with our district is that our district's mission is preparing all students for success in a changing world. In order to do that effectively, we need world-class instruction, whether it's actual teachers contributing to that or we have other parts of the district who contribute to that instruction. It requires data-informed teaching and management. To have data-informed teaching and management, We need to have high quality data, and to have high quality data, you have to do data governance right. Even if it's not the most exciting part of anybody's job, it's something that we have to do intentionally. So I'll kind of pass this back to Rich since I've only been around a couple of
So
months.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So we really want to acknowledge with our staff members that data governance is not a new thing, but it's a thing that we want to intentionally do better, right? So prior to 2017, data governance was really done in small silos. It was the HR team got together with a database analyst and they made a decision about data. And if that affected somebody else down the road, there wasn't necessarily a conversation that happened that said, hey, we're going to be making this change. As that serial killer map becomes more interoperable and more working together, now the changes, if HR makes a change to the way they keep records, now that my identity access management solution relies on their data, they could suddenly kick everybody out of all the distribution groups, or they could have some kind of upset that would make their tools not available. So their data is more important than ever, that it's timely and it's accurate. So this is where we started to run into some problems. We formed a data governance committee in late 2017, and really we're focused on state reportable aspects of data governance. And this was a really important step we took to get people talking in the same room about data and how that impacted PIMS reporting, stuff like that. And then we had an opportunity to reframe that this summer through our cooperation with the Michael Susan Dell Foundation, and really focus on the bigger role of data in strategic decision making across departments and for students. So we focused on those 4 pillars that we talked about. And the foundational document that we put together was a data governance charter that really established this decision making process, why we're having these conversations and what we're trying to accomplish. And we can share a little bit of that if you'd like. So you want to talk a little bit about the charter?
Yeah, so we don't necessarily expect that we've created a data governance charter and everybody in the district cares to read every word of it. But the real goal of doing that and doing it as an inclusive process and bringing in different departments and different people who may not always be involved with data management was to create this sort of centralized documentation of how we deal with data, especially because we often have folks who say, I have an issue with this system, I'm just going to call the person that I know in the tech services department, or the person that I know who's a tech integrator, and we'll figure it out between the two of us. So this was really meant to say, here's the place you fall back to if you have any questions with regard to our systems, the way we enter data, the way we report on data, and it helps people in the district see, okay, if I want to escalate a concern, how do I do that? Who do I tell? What's their status? What's their role? What do they do once I tell them, hey, I think that we should change the way that we label our attendance codes? And then secondly, to say, here's our way of saying as a district that we have a standardized implementation plan for every data governance issue that comes up. So again, it's not like we expect everyone to read our data governance charter, but we put it out there so that anyone in the district, if they have concern, can look back at that as a guiding resource.
We already talked a little bit about these 4 pillars, but these are the themes that we've built our initial look at data governance around, and we think these are pretty good ways of having conversations around that data. And so putting some clarity together about what people's roles in this are has been a really important part of this process, right? So you want to talk just a little bit about the roles and how we've done this, and I'll just put slides.
Yeah. So this has been really critical to us in North Allegheny, is telling everyone, hey, you're not just doing your job anymore, you're also labeled as a data steward or a data user. And we define this hierarchy of how people interact with data in the district and who they can consult if they have issues or questions or ideas for how to do things differently. So at that first level is a data user, and not all data governance plans have the same hierarchy, but this is what we're working with. And a data user is somebody who interacts with data on a daily basis. It might be a teacher. They're not the highest accountability person involved with that data, right? If the state is auditing the district, it's not necessarily the teacher who entered an A- wrong in the grade book that everything is going to boil down to. But it's someone who very frequently interacts with that data. They're putting it in every day, or they're reporting on it every day. At the next level down, we have what we refer to as a data steward. And so this is that next level up. Somebody who has a little bit more accountability to the data that's flowing through their department. So this might be the assistant director of finance, or it might be the administrative assistant to the director of student services. So this is basically a person who's seeing the data very frequently, and they're in a position to make centralized observations about the kind of data they see, for example. So they're more likely to notice when there are patterns and something going wrong and patterns that could be fixed than the individual data user. And then the highest level of accountability there is a data owner. So somebody who is most responsible for that data. That's mostly our executive council folks, our top level district administrators, somebody who is going to have to answer for reporting purposes or has decision-making power over that data. So if it's human resources data, for example, the secretary in the human resources department may not have the ability to say, I want to change our whole data system. The human resources director may have a little more sway to do that. So we label those people as data owners. And the goal here is just not to add to anyone's job description, but to say, hey, we are empowering you specifically to elevate issues as they come and put them through a more centralized process for data governance.
And what we observed was when we took a look at the different areas where they might have been more challenging for some of our folks, it was hard to pin an owner to that data set, right? When we had issues with absence data, there was really not necessarily a person who at the district was the person to go to about absence data. So I think that when we started putting names next to those data ownership roles, that helped to really, show us where some of our challenges and problems might be. And so how does this process work, okay? So we've got these couple of steps and what people can do. You want to talk through these while I click through here?
Yeah, sure.
And then we have an example of a data escalation issue that we went through recently that is a really good kind of indicator of this.
Yeah, so hopefully what you take from this is not that you should use these 5 exact steps, but this is a reference for you, how you might construct data governance in your own district. For us, it works with somebody identifying an issue and proposing it to a data owner. They can do that by talking to me, they can talk to the owner directly, they can talk to anybody on our data governance committee. But first somebody has to say, hey, we need to label our data differently, or hey, we need to use this accounting system for our student activities budgets. Then that person presents that issue to the data governance committee and says, it's come to my attention that this is a matter that we should talk about. And it sounds a little bit hierarchical, but we wanted to set up a few gates where people are able to say, this may not necessarily be a data governance issue that the whole district deals with. Maybe it's just something that we can deal with at a department level. But should they decide that it's important enough to elevate, then they present it to the committee. Then our data governance committee forms a work group. So they bring in, if it's a special education issue, we want to have them bringing in practitioners who are involved with that data. We also may get parents involved, teachers involved, anybody who has an important voice for that issue. And then that work group comes up with a solution and proposes something in a standardized format that we can then share with the district. So they come back to the committee and say, hey, this is how we think we should do things. This is how we should label our data. The committee says yes. And then we post that and implement it. And so we try to say, okay, if we work through this issue together, we can now post this in a centralized place. We have a website for data governance in our district. And anybody who has questions about that in the future can refer to that, and we don't have to go through the process again. Right? They don't have to start again from step 1.
So one of the examples of this that we had recently was a question had come up about students who were in a gender transition situation. And we know that that's a situation where we've gone through this process before. We've supported students and families through this process in different ways. But the documentation of how this was handled in North Allegheny was, we discovered was in an email that I had sent 3 years ago. And everyone was going back to an email that I sent 3 years ago to find out how to do this process. And so when you have new people join the organization that never got that email, suddenly that becomes a problem. There's no documentation. There's no steps in place. Nobody knew what the guidance from the state was, even though that was in the email from 3 years ago. So what this might look like for us is, hey, we have this issue. We know that when you potentially change a name and change a gender, that has an impact on different systems. What systems need to be manually changed? What order do they need to be changed in? And how do we do this? So if we had not gone through this before, we might have gone, okay, we're going to identify the issue, propose that to the owner. That's a demographics and state reporting issue. A proposal might come up to the data governance committee. That data governance committee says, okay, that's important that these people are involved, so we make sure we name the people that are the stakeholders in this. So it might be a building principal who's a little bit more on the front lines, who is involved in helping a student through that transition. It might be counseling staff. It might be people who are actually doing some of the data entry and making those changes. So getting the right people together to talk this through is really important. And then they put together a proposal that the committee approves, and then we implement that. And now we have a place where we store that on a district-wide data governance SharePoint site where all of our documentation is all in one place. So I want to take just a minute to look at that, and then we're happy to open up to any questions or conversation or issues that you're seeing in your district as well. So basically, in order to share this out and disseminate this to our entire organization, we have an internal data governance SharePoint site that really takes the elements of the data governance charter, which you can certainly go and read the entire data governance charter here, which there's a couple of pages to it, and this is all here. We've sort of exploded the data governance charter to share it so that they're available on this SharePoint website. The data governance charter, it lays out the mission and vision and the functions of the committee, but it also has things that are helpful for our folks, such as a data governance glossary. So we have a glossary of commonly understood terms that everybody in North Allegheny can refer to. So when we're talking about metadata, or we're talking about our roles in the district's data governance team, they're all classified here. So we talk about security and privacy, and data aggregation, and de-identification, and disaggregation. We have all this in one place. You can certainly look at that entire document, but when we look at the Data Governance Committee, we have identified different members of our Data Governance Committee. You can see we have a voting body. These are the people who are typically in a decision-making capacity and can represent different issues. So we've got folks from the buildings, we've got folks from the curriculum office, we have assistant superintendents, and student services director, as well as a assistant business director represented in that voting body. We've got technology services staff who are on as standing members of that committee, and Sean in the data governance lead role. We have a little bit more of a breakdown of those committee members when we talk about the subcommittees and work groups that people are on. And so we have a pretty substantial list of people here that are named as being potentially an ad hoc member of the Data Governance Committee, or in some way having some kind of stewardship over different areas of our data. So this took a lot of effort to get to the point where we were identifying all of these different data sets and helping to maintain this list. When Sean talked about matters, we have a standardized way of tracking the matters. It turns out once you put together a committee like this, everybody comes out of the woodwork and says, ooh, here's something that we need to look at. But it's the job of this committee to say, yes, that's important, but also to prioritize a lot of this work. So there are things that we're looking at right now, and other things that we sort of have in the hopper to work later. So, there was a change to state reporting with Tim's name validation. So it was a PIMS change that first names now have to match what the state has on your certificate. Well, if you were 21 years old and you put your Vicky instead of Victoria on your teaching certificate, we typically run into problems. This is a recommendation for how we want the HR department to solve this problem by being a gatekeeper to make sure that this data is accurate. We've got other data items that are on here as well that are anything from registration and enrollment data to student gender issues, one about our EdFi implementation, specifically sort of ongoing, math labeling. We've got one in the hopper for master schedule alignment to our program of studies so that we can get through things, and then really making sure that we have standardized absence codes that we're using. So we've got a number of these things in the hopper, and then typically out of one of these we might end up with a data quality playbook.
Yeah, so this is meant to be a library of documents that anybody in the district, whether they're part of the committee or not, can go to and say, okay, I don't know exactly how we handle it when I have a parent who submits a protection from abuse waiver or document. How do I find out what to do? And this is meant to be the repository they go to. And they see, okay, here I can look through this library. That one is further down the list at this point. But then I can see what is the district's guidance on that. And once again, we do that so we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time we have the same issue. And anybody, whether it's a teacher or a paraprofessional, can go on here and see, okay, this is how I deal with this. I want to work with my student who is trying to calculate their credits for NCAA eligibility. I can go here and find out how that calculator works, or if we have subscribed to that. Anything that comes through the committee should end up as a data quality playbook so that we have this documentation for that. And this is that example we were just going through. So teachers managing a case where a student is changing gender, they see exactly who they need to notify. That person can look back at this document and say, okay, I need to go to BIMS, I need to go to our SIS, do it in this order. And then we work through that process in a centralized way.
Anything else you want me to share from here, or do you want to have questions?
I think that's mostly it. I think the only other thing I'd reemphasize is that this is all stuff that you guys can take advantage of. And that glossary point is something that will be of growing importance to us in a lot of districts going forward. So for example, when you have something like enrollment and somebody says, I would like to know what the enrollment is of your district, you might be familiar with this issue where you say, okay, do you want the enrollment on the first day of school? Do you want our enrollment as of today? Do you want our full-time enrollment? Students who are in our actual buildings?
Third day enrollment?
Yeah, third day enrollment, second semester enrollment. So that's a place to centralize all of these, like, what do we mean when we talk about enrollment? What do we mean when we talk about attendance? Anything like that, this creates this common language around what any data point is in the district. So yeah, this has been a journey and sort of public learning for us as we go over the past few months and year, I guess. And we're happy to share any of these resources if they're useful to any. But at this point, open it up for questions.
So you are willing to share this so we can look at it?
Yeah, so we're able to, if you stop by, just stick around, we'll share what's publicly available to our internal stakeholders, if you'd like to see that.
Sure.
Yeah, we can just share the SharePoint. So you won't see some of the things that are kind of underway. That list won't be quite as long, but we can certainly, you'll be able to see the charter and some of the matters that we've tackled.
And that's actually one of the reasons we want the SharePoint, because it is a thing that has multiple levels of permissions. So we can say if you're on the Data Governance Committee, you have access to all the documents that are in draft format. We don't want everyone in the district to see, like, here's something we haven't made a full decision about yet. So that needs to be protected. And you can do that with SharePoint. It's integrated with Teams, it's integrated with Power Automate. So there's a lot that you can do with it that we're sort of learning at the moment, but it fits well with our O365 suite.
Yeah, last year we started this in Google Sites, and it just wasn't quite enough for what we needed to do. We needed something with a little bit more power. So as we moved into SharePoint, we were able to do a lot more with it.
It's impressive.
We're certainly happy to share, and we want other folks to do this. I mean, I do recognize that we've had to put a lot of energy into this. I've been with the district for about 3 years, and there's been grumblings about, like anywhere, right? No one loves their SIS, like no one, And as you start to dig into it, it's those questions of things that just didn't have owners, right? You didn't have anyone who was willing to make a decision about how to record attendance and implement that decision. So we've started to recognize some of those things that we just need to focus our attention on, so that we can get past them. And maybe we won't love our SIS forever, but maybe we'll like it better if everyone's using it the same way, right? So it's just a matter of a vehicle to focus on those kind of things.
Kind of a different level, but
Sure.
You're kind of at the district level, and I like that you're bringing clarity to the various terms you're going to be using, so everyone's speaking the same language. Do you have any long-term goals for how teachers every day in their classroom can be actually looking at all of these dashboards that a lot of these tools have to offer and integrating that? Is that a long-term goal of yours?
Yeah, absolutely. So the PPT dashboard is very focused and has a small audience. We know that, but it's a great place for us to sort of fail in public a couple of times and do this. We're really taking more of like an agile development approach, where we start with this little bit and we send it out and we get feedback, and then we add an additional feature, and then we gather feedback and make changes. And so having a focused group that knows that we're going through that process is really important. Our end goal is to have a resource that is a kind of a one-stop shop for all of the different data sources that we have. so that we can start really leveraging data-informed insights about students and learning, so that every teacher in their classroom can use those on a daily basis. We're probably a couple of years out from that in this
I think
work.
we're a
but
long way out just from the perspective of teachers. They don't even know what they're looking at a lot of times. I mean, they're seeing so many sources. Even just if you look at some of them are still becoming familiar with SIS, the LMS, and what they're seeing in those areas. So I was just curious, but I like how you said, you understand that there are steps to that process.
Yeah, and I think working toward this project just sort of brings a lot of those concerns to the forefront, right? Like we try to demo a working prototype of a dashboard, and then we find out, okay, this teacher only goes to this version of our SIS, and this teacher likes the interface we have with our data mart better, so that's where they get their data. And another teacher has a self-made spreadsheet. So kind of working through this process, it's not an immediate solution, but it also brings some of those problems to the forefront so we can be more aware of how to develop something that works.
Any other questions? All right. Well, thanks so much for attending our session, and we appreciate your questions. If you're interested in getting some more of this information, I can take care of that now in the last couple of minutes. Thank you.
Thanks.
Sustainable in the future, so we're building capacity. But there's some really fascinating open source projects. Also, we're probably one of the small districts engaging in this at this level right now. So it's a little bit of a challenge from a resource perspective. Because we have a little extra money to make some of that happen. So. So I'm going to share this with you. I did this work for what's his name? Tom Cruise, right?
I think so. Yeah.
All right. So I'm going to just add his name.
It's Cruise. We're friends with Tom Cruise.
Cruise with the Z. Cruise with the Z.
I was feeling a little flattered.
Nah, worked for Tom.
Tom Cruise.
You did Tom Cruise and the North Allegheny School District.